All right, so the very first step for our emboss resist technique is we need to emboss our image. This one, it happens to be a quote. You could do an image. Definitely I would choose something that's a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier, a little bit more solid. So I wouldn't necessarily choose just an outline stamp, simply because you want to make sure that you're able to see what the embossing is resisting. So I've got my Versamark ink, my clear ink. Clearly that stamp, even though I just checked it, was not as clean as it could have been. So this is supposed to be clear, but we're going to go with it. I'm going to put my clear powder on it. I have my clear embossing powder in a container because I tend to use it the most out of all my embossing powders. And this way I don't need a scrap piece of paper underneath it because I can put the excess right back in the container. I'm going to use my heat gun and I'm going to melt the powder. So this heat gun is different from the one I use to dry. This one emits heat more direct. So it's just going to be a bit quicker when I'm doing embossing. And you'll see the powder right now is a matte, but it's going to change shiny as it melts. So as soon as you tilt it in the light and you can see that the embossing powder is all shiny, that means it has completely melted. So I'm going to put my heat gun away. I'm going to move my embossing powder so it's not in my way. So I've got the colors of my markers that I'm going to be using. And like I said, this is supposed to be clear ink, but because of apparently I didn't clean my stamp well enough, it is actually slightly purple, but that's okay. So I actually have a mixed media paper underneath this one because I wanted you to see just the different look of a smoother paper. The mixed media paper that I have right now is Distress Heavy Stock mixed media paper. And you can see that I am not very careful with coloring with my markers here. I'm just trying to get the color down. Once we have the color down, we are going to use our spray bottle and we are going to spray it, and it's going to start, the water's going to start moving the color on the surface. And this is, again, one of those things that you have control over where you lay the color now, but you don't necessarily have control over where it starts to move when you hit it with the water. So make sure that there's nothing in the way that I want wet, and then I'm going to mist it. And I just want to make sure that everything is completely covered in water. Typically, if there's an area that's not very wet, you're going to notice it. So I just have it on my mixed media mat right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move it so that it's on some paper towel, so the paper towel will absorb anything that comes off of it. And then I'm going to let it dry. If I want to speed the drying up, I'm going to use my heat gun and I can speed it up a bit. And you'll notice that there's water with some of the ink beaded up on top of my stamped and embossed image there. That's totally fine. It's not going to stick to the embossing because the embossing is like a plastic, so it will resist the water. So once everything else is completely dry, I can use the paper towel and I can dab any water droplets that are still there. So everything's dry except for these two sides here. Even when you're using cardstock that's meant for water, it tends to still curl, but it kind of helps the ink flow where it's wanting to flow, which is kind of fun. All right, so everything is pretty much dry other than a few beads of ink on top of my embossing. So let's clean that off completely. Make sure I'm using a clean part of my paper towel, and I'm just going to dab it on top of the embossing to remove it from the top. And look how different they turned out. Exactly the same colors, and I used them in exactly the same order, but they changed, or they turned out completely different. So all I would do now is I would glue it to my mat and then glue it to the front of my card. But it's a fun thing to play with because, like I said, you have control over the colors you're using and where you put them. The rest of it is kind of up to the water and the creative fates for where it actually ends up going. But such a fun technique to play with. And it would look really, really cool, I think, if you use, say, some flower silhouettes as well. The only thing I didn't use any because mine are really tiny and I wanted some big ones. But such a fun technique to play with and see what happens. We'll see you in the next one.